This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free lecture notes that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Always, and there are these two variances and only these two. Do them in either order, I don't care. But first of all, the materials expenditure variance. As I've written there, he sometimes calls it the materials price variance. It's the same thing. But remember, all you care about here is, did we pay $4 a kilo or didn't we? Agreed? That's all. I said before, sorry, I won't need to keep repeating this, but how you work out the figure is up to you. If you've learnt a different way, fine. If you see quick ways, fine. You know, the computer doesn't mark your workings. Provided you get the right answer, nobody cares how you did it. I'm not going to confuse. I'll do it the way I did before, the way I always do it. I think the safest. For materials expenditure, always you take what you actually bought, the actual purchases. How many did we actually buy? We bought 120,000 kilos. And whether that's right or wrong, that's what we bought. We compare what we actually paid, the actual cost, with what we should have paid, the actual purchases at standard cost. If you can't read my writing, shout, for heaven's sake, don't guess. But it is always, always the same. And so here, we bought 120,000 kilos. How much did we actually spend? We paid 500,000. If I make a mistake, shout. If you lose a figure, shout. How much should we have paid at the correct price? Well, the 120,000 kilos we bought, we should have paid from the cost card $4 a kilo. We should have paid $4.80. And therefore, surely, it should have been $4.80. We paid $500. We've overpaid by 20,000. And, of course, although it should be obvious when we're talking slowly, the most common mistake of all in the exam is getting the right number, but then forgetting which way round it is. Have we saved? Have we lost? Do you know what I mean? Because in the choice of answers, always 20,000 would appear twice. And it's such a shame we've got the right number. Another silly error. Here, please. Have we saved or have we lost? We've paid more than we should have done, and therefore we've lost money. And remember, always, if you've lost money, we write A for adverse. What's the alternative, please, if we'd saved money? F for favourable. I'll write that down later where relevant. But it's 20,000 adverse. We've paid more than we should have done. All right? I beg your pardon? Fine. All right, that's material expenditure. The other one, and there are only ever the two for materials. The other one is the materials usage. Where we're no longer worried about the price, but even if we had paid the correct price of $4 a kilo, did we use more or less than we should have done? And so for the usage, always work initially in kilos, and to check whether we've used more or less than we should have done, you compare what we actually used. How many kilos did we actually use, please? Yeah, 105,000. As I said, do shout if you've lost a figure, don't guess, or just copy. but we actually used 105,000 kilos. You compare that with what you should have used for your actual production. So the standard usage for the actual production. How many units did we produce? We produced 5,000 units. How many kilos should each unit have taken? From the cost card, it should have been 20 kilos a unit. And therefore, for our production, we should have used, is it 100,000? 100,000. And so I hope, obviously, we used more kilos than we should have done. We've used 5,000 kilos too many. And be careful, again, it sounds silly, but it's when you're rushing. There's almost always one of the answers available would be 5,000. And too many stop there and tick it, easy. But remember, that's in kilos. We want to know how much it's cost us, using too many kilos. And so to cost it out, we've dealt with price, it's no longer relevant. You cost it at standard cost per kilo. And so given a standard cost from the cost card of $4 a kilo, using 5,000 kilos too much would cost us $20,000. Favourable adverse, please? Adverse. We've used more kilos than we should have done. It's adverse. All right? As I've kept saying, I won't keep repeating this. Nobody cares how you get the figures. If you want to get them a different way, fine. I'm not going to show different ways and confuse. All they care about is the final answer. And again, it is just learning rules. There are only ever those two. All right. Before we carry on and look at the others, a couple of things to watch for. The usage variance. Do remember and learn. You're comparing what you used, the actual usage, with what you should have used for the actual production. Because very, very often, to try and trick you, he'd tell you in the question, actual production as here was 5,000, no problem. But he might tell you the budget production. Well, maybe you budgeted on producing 4,000. Well, completely irrelevant. Obviously, if you produce more, you expect to use more. You always compare with what you should have used for the actual production. All right? He may have told you sales as well. He may tell you our actual sales were only 4,500 units. Well, again, for this, it's irrelevant. I don't care how many were sold, the rest would be in inventory. But for your materials variance, always you're comparing with what you should have used for your actual production. All right? So be careful. Although the rule never changes, as I say, he's very likely to give you extra information which is irrelevant to check you know which thing you're giving. All right? All nice? So that's just being careful, but do watch it. One of the most common mistakes of all is using sales or budget or something. It's always actual production. Two other things. Here was as hard as he can make it. I told you actual purchases were 120. We only used 105. The rest was inventory. Yeah. He does that occasionally. Usually, though, he doesn't give you two separate figures. It should be fairly obvious what I'm about to write, but if you're not told different, then you assume that we used everything we purchase. So the usage equals the purchases. I think that should make sense. Here I told you we bought 150 and only used 105 or whatever it was. If all I'd said was the actual was 120,000 kilos, 500,000, and there was nothing else, you would have assumed we'd used all 120. All right? Very last of all, and what I'm about to say will apply to all the variances. Usually, he tests you directly on the split. He might say, what's the materials usage variance? 2 marks. He might say, what's the materials expenditure variance? 2 marks. Or he might say, what are expenditure and usage? And now 4 choices of 2 there. You with me? Occasionally, now very rarely, but watch for the word, he might say, what is the materials cost variance? Now, it's a bit annoying because of the English, but if he simply says, what is the cost variance? Well, although it's not very often, the cost variance is simply the total variance. And by total, I simply mean the total. And so in this one, since we have already done the analysis, here we've lost 20,000 by paying too much, the expenditure. We've lost 20,000 because we've used too much, the usage. The total is 40, you agree? However, if he does simply say, what's the total? Then, of course, although you could do the 2 separate and add them, that takes time. If he did say what's the total, you can write it almost straight down. For the total variance, all you need to do is this. The actual total cost was how much, please? Oh, is somebody going to give me a figure? The actual total we spent was 500,000. Does everyone agree? However, of course, some of that was left in inventory. Do you agree? So we didn't actually spend 500,000 on what we produced. And so let's take off what's left in inventory. How many units were left in inventory? 15,000. And can anyone remember, now it's unlikely he'll do this, but I want to do it to be safe. Can anyone remember, in management accounting, how do we value inventories? In management accounting, you always value your inventory at standard cost. And so, sorry, it's not 15,000 units, it's 15,000 kilos, I do beg your pardon. What's the standard cost per kilo? $4. And so, the inventory would be valued at 60,000. And therefore, surely the actual cost of what we used in production is 440. Well, that's what we actually spent on production. Hello, Yelena. To get the total variance, simply compare with the standard cost of the actual production. How many units did we actually produce, please? 5,000. What's the standard cost per unit, please? 80. Each unit should have cost 80, and therefore we should have spent 400. We spent 440, and therefore the total variance, or the cost variance, is 40,000 adverse, which of course agrees with what we had before. Almost always he'd want the analysis. What we've just done is irrelevant. But just watch the words. If he does say what's the total cost variance, then all he's after is that 40. Alright? Hope that makes sense. So that's it. That is unusual. It is rare. But again, it's such a shame if you've learned the rules that you miss it just because of the word. Expenditure or price variance, usage variance. The cost variance is simply the total. Anyway, that's materials. There is as hard as it could ever be. I can't really, it'd be a bit silly to pause and give you a test until we check them all. Can we check the second one, please? Labour. All right, come. We should be able to get faster and faster because a lot of what I've said applies to all of them and I won't keep repeating. But again, labour, in your exam, it's always the same, 3 that you've got to learn. The check with me and let's do it. The standard cost of labour, every unit should take 8 hours. We should pay $3 an hour. Each unit should be $24. During the month, we produce 6,000 units. We paid for 52,000 hours of labour and we paid $3.20 an hour. We only worked for 49,500. All right, let's check. See who remembers. But again, it is just learning. It's always the same. I've listed the 3 variances. First of all, labour rate of pay. How you learn them is up to you, but effectively it's the same logic as materials expenditure. To check on the rate of pay, it should be $3 an hour, you take the actual hours we paid. And so, rightly or wrongly, we paid for 52,000 hours. All we're checking here is, did we pay the right rate or not? And so you compare the actual cost with the standard cost. And so what rate did we pay for those hours? We paid $3.20. And so we'll have paid, I've lost my calculator, here we are, 52,000 at $3.20 is 166,400. How much should we have paid? Well, again, it's the actual hours paid, but at standard cost. 52,000 hours. How much should each hour have cost, please? $3 from the cost card. So at $3, we should have paid, keep checking me please, but I think 156. The difference is the variance. So the variance here is what? Is it 10,400? Favourable, adverse, please? And I'll stop asking because I can't hear answers. We've paid more than we should have done. Surely it's an adverse variance. Well, I've kept saying, all I can do is remind you of the rules. If I said it too fast, shout. You can't read my writing, shout. But otherwise it's learning. I did say earlier that in the exam, do it any way you want. It should, in fact, be obvious, I think, to most of you, that in fact, here, because you're paying an extra 20 cents an hour, you could have written that almost straight down, that since you bought 52,000 hours, at 20 cents an hour extra, again, it's 10,400. Well, again, for me to write it different ways just confuses. If something's obvious, do whatever you want. But is everybody clear about the basic rule? It's whatever you paid, compare your rate with standard rate. Okay? Having dealt with that, the next variance should be the most obvious of all, once you're happy with the word, the idle time. Remember what you mean by idle time. Idle time is hours when you're doing nothing, but you're still being paid. And obviously, if for any reason people are paid for hours when you do no work, clearly it's losing money. And so idle time, you simply check in hours, how many hours are they doing nothing? And again, it may be immediately obvious, but if I write it down in full, you compare the actual hours we paid. We paid for what? 52,000? Compare that with the actual hours they worked. They worked 49,500. And surely, and here, do see the logic. Makes it so much easier to remember. But it must mean that the idle time, the hours they did no work, is the difference of, is it 2,500 hours? Well, as I said before, if you're paying them when they don't work, we've clearly lost money. But remember, for the moment, it's only in hours. To cost it out, we cost it at standard cost per hour. If this was all that went wrong, we've wasted 2,500 hours. Standard cost per hour from the cost card is $3. And therefore it's lost us, I think I'm right, 7,500. I hope obviously it's lost us money. The idle time, it would always be adverse. Finally, even if, having dealt with idle time, having dealt with the rate, the final bit, of course, is did they work fast enough? Every unit should have taken 8 hours. We need to check. Did we take longer or did we work faster? So the last one, and again, obviously, make sure you've learnt the names. But the last one is the labour efficiency. Efficiency, did we work faster or slower than we should have done? Again, for efficiency, work always in hours. And to check whether we're faster or slower, we compare the actual hours we worked so how many hours did we work? We worked 49,500. Compare with the hours we should have worked, the standard hours for the actual production. And so make sure you're grabbing the right figures How many units did we produce? We actually produced 6,000. How many hours should each unit have taken? From the cost card, it should have taken 8 hours a unit. And therefore we should have worked 48,000 hours. We took 49.5. The difference, 1,500 hours. Again, it's silly, keep repeating, but I can't stress enough. Remember, that's only in hours. To cost it out to get the dollars, you cost it at standard cost per hour. From the cost card, each hour should be $3. Again, if this is all that went wrong, it would have cost us 4,500. Favourable adverbs, please. I said I wouldn't ask again. We've taken longer than we should have done, and therefore we've lost money. It's adverse. All right, again, two things. Sorry, one bit I don't apologise for keep repeating is do remember it's standard hours for actual production. Again, it's so likely that he'll tell you how many you budgeted on producing, he'll tell you how many you sold, all sorts of things. Always for cost variances. It's what we should have taken for our actual production. Alright? Do be careful there. Secondly, I have said before, and I think it's fairly obvious, quite often he doesn't tell you hours paid, hours worked. Quite often he might just say, there were 52,000 hours at 320, full stop. Well, if you're not told, you assume that hours paid equals hours worked. Obviously, read carefully, make sure you haven't missed something. But if all he says is it's 52,000 hours and nothing else, you would assume that's what we paid for and that that's what we worked. Alright? It should be obvious, but tell me, in that case, which variance would disappear? Idle time. Idle time isn't always there. As I say, check carefully, but assume that you're the same if it's the same. Alright? Good. Easy. Lovely. No tricks. Learn the rules. It couldn't be nicer. Alright, nearly there. Again, in this exam, you've only ever 4 costs to deal with. So materials, you've got them. Labour, you've got them. The next one, variable overheads. We'll be happy, Laura. It's fun. This one, oh, what's happened? Sorry. Variable overheads. This one, in fact, is the least commonly asked. Usually, it's materials, labour, and in a moment fixed. But he can ask variable, so let's check. Check my figures. Oh, everything's going wrong now. Help! We're back. Hard luck, we nearly had a break there. No, variable overheads. Just a couple of things here. First of all, if you look at the standard cost is 6 hours at $2. It's $12 a unit. If he does have variable overheads, then always they'll be charged on an hourly rate. Are you with me? Like the cost card. And always, if it's asked, it's the same as labour. What I mean is, although you'll only get extracts like this, always we say if each unit took 6 hours labour, then automatically there'd be 6 hours of overheads. Clear? And so it should be 6 hours a unit at $2, $12 in total. During the month, we worked 7,100 hours. We paid 13,900 for variable overheads. Here you've just got the two variances. First of all, expenditure. As I say, it'll always be on hours. And so to check the expenditure, did we pay $2 an hour or didn't we? You take the actual hours we worked, which was 7,100. And you compare the rate we paid per hour with what we should have paid. So actual hours worked at actual cost. How much did we pay? 13,900. Compare it with what we should have paid for those hours. Had we paid the right price per hour, the standard cost. Actual hours worked at standard cost. Well, again, we worked 7,100 hours. From the cost card, the overhead should have been $2 per hour. And therefore, we should have spent 14,200. As I kept saying, get it the right way round, obviously. Here we should have spent 14,200. We only spent 13,900. So we've saved money. We've saved, is it 300? And I hope clearly, because we've saved money, it's favourable. Finally, though, although that deals with the rate per hour of $2, the other problem, of course, is did we take longer or shorter than 6 hours a unit? The other bit is the efficiency variance. And for efficiency, it's always the same workings as for labour efficiency for the same reasons. Always. To check whether we're faster or slower, you work in hours, you compare the actual hours we worked, which was 7,100. Was that quicker or slower? You compare it with the hours we should have worked, the standard hours for the actual production. How many did we produce? It was 1,200 units. How many hours should we have worked per unit? It was 6. And therefore we should have worked 7,200. I hope obviously we were faster. We've saved 100 hours. Cost it out as always at standard cost. Here per hour. $2. And so again, if that's all that had changed, working faster, would have saved us 200. All right. Not much else I can say there, to be honest. But again, it is the least likely variable, but when it is there, with those two same rules, it's never any different. Happy? Fine. All right. Well, the reason I said you're happy is because, if we remember, it's the final one, which is the funny one. It needs the most learning. Materials, labour and variable. They really should be automatic. In one sense, I hope that was boring. But whether it was or it wasn't, that's pure learning. They've got to be easy marks. Fixed overheads. Well, although again, it is just learning, it is the one that's perhaps a bit less logical. Again, we chatted before. I'm not going to repeat all that. It's got to be the rules. Here, now, quite importantly, for this example, it says, our company uses absorption costing. I will write down later and remind you, but if you already know, we've got the two ways of costing, absorption and marginal. Remember, for materials, I say I will write this down after, but for materials, labour and variable overheads, it's irrelevant which way we're costing. The variances are always the same. All right? So it normally doesn't even tell you. But for the previous three, it wouldn't make any difference. If he said we were using absorption, if we said we were using marginal, the workings are always the same. It's fixed overheads where the two would be different. I'll remind you, or you can tell me the difference after, but for this one, we're using absorption costing. All right? And therefore, on our cost card, we've got fixed overheads per unit. They've been absorbed, it's $12. And for variance analysis, they'll always have been absorbed based on labour hours. And so the cost card, it'd always be on an hourly basis. We're working 4 hours for each unit. If we've absorbed at the rate of $3 an hour, then fixed overhead, 4 hours of work, $3, $12 a unit. All right? During the month, we produced 9,000 units. We actually worked 35,000 hours. We paid 100,000 for fixed overheads. All right? Well, on this sheet is everything he could ask. To ask all of them in one question is impossible. But he can ask for any one or two of these variances in one question. So let's do everything you could ask, and then I'll summarise and make sure you're all with me. First of all, this is one place certainly where he might simply ask for the total fixed overhead variance. So the total variance, and here's a place incidentally. Last time I went to a lot of trouble trying to explain the logic, why things work the way they do. I'm not going to repeat that. If it worries you, you'll have to ask me separately. But in the exam, it's fairly irrelevant. You know, you just learn the rules and you do it. All right? However, the total variance, remember we're using absorption costing here. For the total, you compare the actual total cost. Now shout please, because my ears are thick. But you tell me, well, how much did we spend in total for fixed overheads? 100,000. For total variance, you compare that with the standard cost of the actual production. And again, be careful, because he's likely to tell you budget production, budget sales, actual sales. It's the standard cost of the actual production. How many units did we actually produce, please? 9,000. It's better I say, and then you shout if you've lost it or if I've picked it wrong. But we actually produced 9,000 units. How much should each unit cost? $12. The standard cost per unit is 12, and therefore it should be 108,000. And therefore the total variance is 8,000. And again, get it the right way. It should be 108. We've only spent 100. It's favourable. We've saved 8,000. So that's the first thing you could ask. Simply the total. All right? Secondly, though, he could ask you to analyse that into why it was 8,000. And the first analysis are the next two, the expenditure and the volume. Again, it's rules, so let's do it. First of all, the expenditure variance. For expenditure variance, you compare the actual total cost. I beg you keep checking the figures. And there's no doubt you're clear what we mean. But the actual cost was 100,000. You compare it with the budget total cost. Can you all check for me? How much in total did we budget on spending on fixed overheads? I think so, but check carefully. He might just give you a figure. If he said if the budget was 50,000, then there you are, no problem. Here, and more likely, I haven't told you the budget figure, but you do know at the very first line, you budgeted on producing 8,000. And on the cost card, you'd budgeted on each unit being $12. And so it must mean that the total budget fixed overheads were 8,000 at $12, which is 96,000. That's 8,000. It's the budget production standard cost per unit of 12. We must have originally budgeted on 96,000. All right? Sorry being slow, but although we can all learn a rule, do make sure you're clear where the numbers are coming from. Well, that's what you budgeted on spending. And of course, fixed overheads should really stay fixed whatever happens. And so whatever happened, we should have spent 96. We spent 100. The expenditure variance is 4,000. And here it is important because of what's coming. You tell me. Favourable, adverse? Adverse. You spent more in total than we should have done. It's 4,000 adverse. However, the other problem is because of using absorption costing. We've been charging every unit at $12. If we produce more or less units, then we've got a variance. So the other bit of the analysis is the volume variance. And again, be careful. It's easy rules. I can remind you and then learn it. But I'll stress when we come to it, be careful of one thing. For volume variance, the problem is that we've produced more or less than budget. You always work in units. And you compare your actual production with your budget production. When you're learning, do remember, in both cases it's production. Any mention of how many we sold is completely irrelevant. How many did we actually produce? We actually produced 9,000 units. How many did you budget on producing? The budget was 8,000 units. And so in units, here you produced more than budget, 1,000. And to put a value to it, remember, and be careful here, people do silly things, but we all do when we're rushing. That's in units. You cost it out at standard cost per unit. The standard cost per unit from the cost card is $12. The variance, is everybody clear about the number? Is 12,000. Well, again, whether you've already learned it or you haven't, the rule itself is easy. You just learn and then it's being careful. But if you remember, of all the variances, this is the one that's least obvious, whether it's favourable or adverse. The others, you can make silly mistakes clearly, but if you think it's obvious, this is the one which causes the problem. Because again, on the answers, the choice of answers, there'd always be 12,000 favourable, 12,000 adverse. Real problem. I'll remind you in a minute how I remember. But anybody, is that favourable or adverse? Oh, good, everybody remembers, or we've just looked back and cheated in a sense. No, without, as I said, chatting back through the logic again, at this stage it's irrelevant. I think the easiest way to remember it is to say, and I'll write it down, but we've produced more units than we expected. This isn't the true reason, but it always works. We've produced more units. If we produce more units, we can sell more units, which is great. We've done well to produce more. If we've done well, it's good, it's favourable. I say I'll write that down. It always works. If you've got a better way, fine. But it's such a shame to get the right number, obviously, and then the wrong. Favourable, adverse. My logic is produced more. If we have managed to produce more, we've done well. It's good. And if we've done well, it's favourable. And I hope what I don't need to write down. If you produce less, we've done badly, it would have been adverse. Alright? Like I say, it's up to you. But do make sure that you've found a way of checking which favourable adverse. Okay? Alright, well, at that stage, of course, do be clear where we are. We knew the total variance was 8,000. And I've already said if you simply ask for total, that's your answer. We've now analysed it. We've got an expenditure variance. What was it? Saved me going backwards. Was it 4,000 adverse? Hello? We've got a volume variance. of 12,000 favourable. And therefore, the total we already knew was 8,000 favourable. Have I got the figures the right way around there? I've remembered them right. Fine. He won't ask you for all three. But make sure you're clear where they all fit together in a sense. But clearly, you could pick any one or two of those three. Make sure you remember which is which. Okay? However, we have finally the one extra bit. That the volume variance, we know we've produced more units, and therefore we've got 12,000. But he can expect you to be able to split that into the final two, which are capacity and efficiency. So, last bit of rules. First of all, capacity. I said I wasn't going to chat through all the logic, and I'm not, but even so, we've managed to produce more units. One reason for having more units is that I managed to get more hours. If I get more hours, we can produce more units. For capacity variance, you look at your hours and you compare the actual hours we worked How many hours did we manage to work? It was 35,000. And we check whether that was more or less hours than we expected. You compare it with your budget hours. How many hours, please, did I budget on having? Yeah. It may just tell you a figure, in which case use it. But here he doesn't need. He's told us how many we budget on producing, 8,000 units. The budget production. We know how many hours we budgeted for each unit. From the cost card it was 4 hours. Standard hours. And therefore, we thought we'd only have 32,000 hours. So that's how many hours we expected to have. We got 35. We had 3,000 extra hours. Cost it out, but again be careful because here we're in hours. Cost it out at the standard cost per hour. Standard cost per hour from the cost card is $3, and therefore it's 9,000. Again, the number is obviously just rules, but is it favourable or is it adverse? It's favourable. Use the same logic as before, that here we've had more hours. If you've got more hours available, you can make more units. And if you can make more units, well, as I said earlier, that's good. And therefore, it's favourable. The more hours we get, the more units we can make, the better we do. What? Finally, the other reason for making more or less units is because they're working faster or slower. So very last of all, the efficiency variance. And I said before, and if you've been practicing, you already know, this should be easy because efficiency variance, it's always the same rule. as variable efficiency and labour efficiency. All three efficiencies are the same rule. You work in hours, you compare the actual hours you worked, which was 35,000. And just as with the other two, to see if you're faster or slower, you compare with the standard hours for the actual production. So for the very last time, do be careful when he gives you budget actual production sales. Standard hours for the actual production. We actually produced 9,000. From the cost card, it should be 4 hours a unit, which is 36,000. The difference is 1,000 hours. Cost at standard, but do watch for this. It's amazing how many get everything perfect and then do something stupid. Since you're working in hours, you'll cost at standard cost per hour. Standard cost per hour is $3. Total 3,000. This one should be obvious. Any error here should be a silly mistake. But favourable adverse for the last time. It's favourable. You've worked faster than you would have expected. And therefore, it's favourable. All right? And again, just for completeness, although unlikely to be a problem in the exam he just picks one or two of all of those, and you've either got the rule or you haven't. Do remember, though, that those two together, capacity and efficiency, capacity was what? 9,000 favourable. Efficiency 3,000 favourable. The two together is your volume. I say it's unlikely actually to test you on that. It's just work out this variance, that variance, that variance. But he just could expect you to know that those two together is analysing the volume. I'm not going to wind back, but don't let me stop on a bad one. Was the volume variance 12,000 favourable? Good, otherwise that would have been embarrassing. Alright. Alright, well, as far as the cost variances are concerned, that is it. Again, it is just rules. I always feel a bit guilty here. If you've been practising, that was probably boring. Sorry. If you haven't been practising, that perhaps was too fast. Sorry. But whichever way round, you have no choice. Given it's likely to be between 10 and 15% of the exam. Well, it is your choice, obviously, but when it's 10 to 15% of the exam, when most of them, I'll talk about a few tricks later, but when most of them are just have you learned the rule you haven't, and are you careful? I think it's silly not to be able to get most of that 10-15%, and if you can, given you only need 50 in total, it's a nice start. All right? I'll check you on the sales variances later. Most of the work is on costs. I better mention just one final thing here. I said before, well, it gives you two ways of costing: absorption and marginal. For the first three, for materials, labour, variable, it's irrelevant. The variances are exactly the same, whichever costing method you're using. However, make sure you remember that for fixed overheads, I'm not going to write an essay here. If it's absorption costing, you need all those variances that were on that sheet. However, if it's marginal costing, well, because you're not absorbing, only one of those variances is relevant. Which one, anybody? The fixed overheads. If it's marginal costing, there is only one variance. Which? Some of you were here last time. I probably sent you to sleep, that's why. If it's marginal costing, there is only the expenditure variance. Will somebody just look back? What was the number, please? The expenditure variance. Nobody's looking back, you're scared. The expenditure was 4,000 adverse. It's the same rule as before. I'm not writing the rule down. But if it's marginal costing, there's only the expenditure variance. There is no volume variance because you're not absorbing. But do remember that. Fixed overheads, it'll probably be absorption because then he's got more he can test you on. But do check. If there's any mention of marginal, everything is identical except fixed overheads.